You asked and we're answering. Whether you attended one of the PADS Professional Routing Automation webinars events live or watched the recording on demand, some great questions were asked. So let's get the answers. Hi there, I'm John McMillan, and welcome back to another edition of this special series of PCB Tech Talks, the After the Webinar podcast series. In this special podcast series, I'll be joined by webinar presenters, and we'll be answering and discussing the questions submitted by attendees. As always, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Let us know the topics you'd like to discuss, and if you'd like to be our guest right here on PCB Tech Talk. Today, I'm joined once again by the webinar demo presenter, Brent Klingforth. Hey, Brent, welcome back to another After the Webinar series podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Hey, thanks again, John, for putting this together. And I think the webinar was a great success. A lot of questions we have to go through here, so this could take a little while.
It really was. I mean, the attendance was excellent, actually. I mean, I'm really excited about how many people showed up and watched the webinar. And my understanding, there's quite a few people viewing it on demand as well. As promised, we're going to start addressing the questions that were asked during two sessions. We had two, for folks that don't know, a European session and one here in the US. And we have a collection of questions from each. So I'm going to start off by asking a question that came up and was answered actually during the sessions. The question is, can you use sketch routing for every net? And I think, you wouldn't is kind of the answer, but you could absolutely, for things like large buses, differential pairs, DDR routing, where you have lots of nets, nets that go from a CPU like to a memory, things like that is a great fit for this. Physical interfaces, things you would do to, connectors on the ends, USB ports, things like that, you'll probably end up doing those by hand. But I find that people that have been in industry in a while, like us, right, Brent? A long time.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
We have processes in place, and I don't know about you, but I usually start, after placement, I usually look at the RATs and then determine my breakouts from there. And then, whatever net scheduling has to occur, looking at the critical nets, like you did during your demonstration, come up with a strategy for how I want to use it and how I want to use Sketch Router. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I usually look at the placement very heavily while I'm obviously the RATSNET connections going between components and how the logical circuits have to be routed with each other. I didn't show a lot of placement stuff in the design during the webinar, but the idea is, again, obviously you need to place the component so that the connections route logically between groups of components, and using interaction between the schematic and the PCB is key to making a lot of that work properly. And Professional actually has a group function where you can place components in groups that help you. And again, I should have shown this during the webinar, but you can place components based on groups and see all the connections going between them. We concentrated very heavily on just routing in this webinar, but that is a great way for doing planning. And then from there, you can place out the components individually. But yeah, sketch routing, like you said, John, is really meant for larger groups of nets. I mean, you can use it for onesie twosies, but that's what interactive routing is for those onesie twosies.
Yeah, I find it, in my experience, it's very good for as the types of signals that we described. But once you've got those out of place, then auto routing may be a great fit for all the digital nets that don't have all those they aren't highly constrained. That is. So the answer. So can you use sketch routing for every net? Sure, but you probably wouldn't.
Exactly.
Another thing is sketch routing an add-on to PADS Professional? And I think you answered this one in the call, right, Brent, on the webinar?
Yeah, I believe we did. Sketch routing is part of PADS Professional. It's not an add-on feature. So anyone that buys, the PADS Professional Design Suite will have all the same capabilities that we showed in the webinar. That was one of the key things I really tried to do during the webinar.
Right. And so the answer was no. And sketch routing's automated routing, it does include the sketch router itself, the real trace routing feature, and Dynamove. And that's something that you demonstrated very well during the webinar. So next question was, does the Sketch Router add lots of vias? So the answer to that is no. In fact, the Sketch routing automatically optimizes the pin escapes from components like BGAs so that they can be routed, just like they are with the breakouts without adding any additional vias. And as you saw in the demonstration, you can pick the locations and layer to layers when you do have to insert additional vias. So in fact, sketch routing automatically optimizes the pin escapes from components like BGAs so that they can be routed without any additional vias.
Let me add a little bit to that, John, in that there was another question that was kind of similar to that question. What is the maximum number of layers that the auto router can be useful for? Well, sketch routing, my answer is going to kind of help answer your question, the question you mentioned, John, and this question is that the sketch router is really meant to route on one layer. It's meant to do what you would do as a human when you're routing the board. That's the idea behind the architecture of what sketch routing is. So it's only going to add vias during the route path if you choose to tell it to put vias there. So like in the demonstration, I want to go back to the timed example at the very end of the webinar. If you haven't watched it yet, it's a good idea to see how much faster sketch routing is. But I chose to put a layer change at one point, and I can choose different via configurations to put in that spot and then complete the route. So at the end of the day, the real answer is sketch routing does not add vias unless you tell it where to put them in the design. So one thing I started the webinar with was fanning out, using automation to fan out components. That is obviously one of the very first things that should be done after you place your parts is, especially with BGAs, you should always fan out your parts. Don't try and do it while you're actually routing. It's going to end up being a mess, and you can't optimize your design roles around the via placements of the BGA. So it's best to use automation, get that out of the way very quickly, and Paths Professional, as I showed in the webinar, does it very fast and accurately. So it's something everyone should be using in their design. So,
and optimizing, particularly in BGAs, via for routing channels and spacing, it's absolutely critical that the BGAs and high pin count devices are broken out. And some people do breakouts before, some do it after. But I find it's always, I find that it's sometimes better after you see the nets list to figure out which orientations you want your vias to be broken out of BGAs. And a lot of that will depend on how the rat's nest plays out.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the cool things that you can do with the fan out setup capability in Professional, is I can experiment with different fan out options and how I think I'm going to route that. So you don't have to commit to one thing right up front. You can play around with it. And that's the other beauty of sketch routing, is not having to spend all this time routing something and realize, oh, I could have done it this way better if I just would have did this. With sketch routing, you just let the router do everything for you. You go, oh, I don't like that. It only took like 2 seconds for it to route it anyway. Just undo it, go back and change maybe some via locations, change your design rules slightly, route it again. And you'll end up with a much more optimal routing solution using sketch routing than trying to do it all by hand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so one of the questions came up, is sketch routing strictly a Paths Professional feature?
Yeah, so as far as the sketch routing that was shown in the demonstration, that is Paths Professional, but for Paths Standard and Standard Plus, you can still do some stuff similar to sketch routing. It's just you can't draw a guided line necessarily where you want it to go, but you can select a group of nets, and you can tell it to just auto route that set of nets, and it will go off and do its thing, and then you can make adjustments as you want to that. So it's some similar technology there, not quite as nice as the sketch routing feature, but it is there to some extent.
And along those lines, in Paths Professional, there was some questions about which version supports sketch. Is it Paths VX and beyond?
The sketch routing technology was added in the very first VX releases. So in Paths Professional VX 0 on forward, sketch routing technology was there. It's obviously been improved since then, but it has been around since the very first VX release of Paths Professional and Expedition as well.
Here's an easy one. What's the maximum number of layers that this auto routing capability can be used for?
So I kind of answered that one a little bit earlier with the does the sketch router add a lot of vias? But to go in a little bit more details, Paths Professional has far more layers capability than any board is capable of producing today. So in effect, there really are no limits on the number of layers that you can have in a printed circuit board design. And again, the sketch router is only going to route on those layers that you draw the sketch on. You have to tell it to do a transition from one layer to another. But the absolute question, maximum number of layers, for all reality purposes, there are none. It's pretty much unlimited because no one can produce a 250 layer board out there today. So,
okay, here's another question for you, Brent. When via stitching has been created on a plane area, if the plane area needs to be modified afterwards, do I then need to delete all the stitching vias and then create them again? It's a good question.
No, you don't have to create them again. If you modify the shape to be smaller and now those vias are obviously outside the shape, you can simply select just those vias that are outside the shape and delete them. If you make it bigger, you can just fill in the extra space that is there, and the tool will obviously try to use a similar placement of vias that was there already. However, if you want to ensure that everything ends up in a very nice looking grid, then it might be a good idea to go back and remove all the vias that were placed there. But by no means do you have to if you make the shape bigger. It can just take over what area is left and fill it in for you based on the rules that you used last time.
Yeah, via stitching is very dynamic, and there's a lot of options of different patterns and spacings that you can use for via stitching. So that's a really unique and great feature.
Yeah, and I think I showed it in the webinar, but you can actually save off schemes. So if you have one design pattern that seems to work well for you, you can save that as a scheme and reuse it over again from design to design to design.
We see a lot of the stitching done in RF designs where a lot of connection to planes are occurring. What is the best optimum grid setting for sketch routing? Brent, you on your demo, what was your grid setting when you were doing your sketch routing?
Yeah, so while I was using Sketchrouter in that design, this has been my habit for many years now when I was a consultant, is that I really don't use a design grid anymore. There's no purpose like we used to in the past to use a specific design grid because everything's based off shapes now. It's all based off design rules. It's push and shove. Back in the day, you had to worry about, well, if I wanted to put another trace in here, I can bump these over one grid spot. Now I know I can get a trace in there. We no longer have to worry about those concerns anymore. You just push and shove stuff through an area and it does its job. And it's all based off of design rule spacing. So there really is no optimal grid for sketch routing. I use one. Sometimes I turn it off completely.
Exactly. It can be very constraining when you do that set of routing grid. Here's an interesting question. Will this help using PADS netlist?
Yeah, so we kind of answered this a little bit earlier as sketch routing available in PADS standard or standard plus. So PADS netlist flow, which is part of standard or standard plus, obviously does not have sketch routing. We kind of mentioned that already, but you still have auto routing capability and you still have interactive routing. So that environment in itself does have its own auto routing technology. You just, in order to take advantage of something similar to Sketch, you just grab groups of nets, not the entire board. Grab a bus or something that you create a class of, and then let the auto router route that bus for you, and it will go off and auto route it. It will add vias, switching between layers and stuff, but you can help constrain some of that as well. So yes, it does work in netlist flow, just not exactly like how we showed it with PADS Professional Sketch Router.
Okay, so another interesting question is, how does Sketch Router work with blind and buried vias?
So it works just like it would with standard through-hole vias. If you have your blind and buried via set up in PADS Professional, and you tell the tool to start, say, on layer 1 and go to layer 2, the next best option will be using a blind via, or from layer 1 to 2 if you have it set up instead of doing through. So the sketch router will use that via type when routing between those two layers versus going all the way through the board. So the tool picks the most appropriate one based on the layer that you're going to.
Okay, great. You did a really great demo. I love watching tuning. I've done a lot of that in my time, tuning traces. I love seeing the automation of it. One of the questions was, can you tune multiple, or would you want to tune multiple traces simultaneously?
So yeah, the way I showed it in the webinar was again what comes with Paths Professional when you buy the basic suite. What I showed was manual or interactive tuning. So where I can start a tune and then I can use a drag box to make it taller, longer, and I can adjust it in any way that I want. And I have a little
Hmm.
tuning meter on my cursor that tells me if I've met my design rule or not. That's a
Hmm.
really nice function actually because it treats the tune as a little block. And what I mean by that is it when I click on it again, it knows exactly where it is, and I can just drag the box around to a new location. If you use interactive tuning, or if you use the add-on option to route or tune multiple traces, those tunes are now like individual trace segments. So when you want to move them, it's a little different story. So, in my opinion, the interactive tune or the manual tuning is really kind of the best way to do it because it allows you the most freedom in doing adjustments and making changes in the future. Now, obviously, if you have a differential pair bus with 256 differential pairs in it, it's kind of hard to go tune that all by hand. It's going to take time. Maybe adding on the multi-trace tuning option is your best bet at that point because with a differential pair, that tuning option will not only tune diff pair to diff pair, but it will also do phase tuning for the traces of the pair. So it can add, little bumps in certain spots to keep the signal in phase as it's routing from component to component.
Okay, let me ask you this as a practice. Do you save tuning for last?
No, I will always tackle the hard sections first. Those hard sections are usually the ones that have tuning.
Hmm.
So, like, I didn't show it much in the webinar. In fact, I had a bunch of it routed already, but I routed the DDR section pretty much completely. I did a little bit of tuning in that section, but I would always tackle those sections first and get that out of the way because they have tendency to take up the most space, and you want to have all that stuff out of the way. You don't want other vias from other layers getting in the way. Once they're already there, you need to avoid those sections easy, and it's just a lot easier to deal with.
Okay. There's a question about accessing some or all of the capabilities that you were doing during your demonstration through modeless commands. Were you using modeless command for any of your editing
I
or
did,
any of your
yeah,
demonstration?
I did not in the demonstration. There are hotkeys for obviously a lot of things. Like there's a hotkey for sketch route. There's one for drawing sketch. There's one for interactive tuning. Of course, you can double click on a net and start interactive tracing or interactive routing, not tuning. Sorry. So there are a lot of shortcut keys already defined in the tool. Paths Professional actually doesn't call key-in commands modeless. They call them key-in commands, but just like the Paths Standard Plus, Paths Professional does have commands that you can just type in. Obviously, if you have those memorized, I didn't really use any, say, modeless commands in the demonstration, but I definitely did use shortcut keys to assist with routing.
Okay. The next question is, will SketchRouter add vias without users specifying them? So I noticed I didn't notice at any point you actually switching vias. I noticed you switching, layer to layer, but do you have a default via set or is it part of the net?
So in professional, you do set up what vias you're going to be allowed to use in that design, and then in the constraint editor system (CES), for a class of nets, you can define which vias you're allowed to use while you're routing that class of those nets, or you can even do it by area. So in the design we were using, I actually had an area rule around one of the BGAs because I wanted to be able to route a differential pair completely through a via field without having this traces separate around the vias. So I had set up a different via for that BGA, and I also had a separate set of design rules for that BGA area, which again is a very, very big time saving function when it comes to routing a board because having to switch trace widths and design rules manually between components or areas like that is a very difficult thing to do. And professional handles that inherently with your design rules. So as far as me choosing what vias to put in, well, I was doing, say, my time trial at the end there, you can pick the via type that you want to use if there are multiple ones available when I place that via site for vias to be placed. But like I said, if the tool will also automatically choose the via type if you're doing blind and buried based on the layer you're coming and going to. So you do have full control over all that from design rules or interactively on the fly.
Good to know. Does SketchRoute untangle groups of nets? I don't think I saw you doing any untangling in your webinar.
I didn't. SketchRouter is, again, a very intelligent algorithm to where it won't pin swap nets, but it will try in the background to route out of like a BGA or something like that and unscramble the nets the best it can by how it chooses to route those nets out of that BGA. So that's one of the powerful capabilities of SketchRouter, is being able to route the traces in the same way a human would to escape all of those nets that you're requesting it to route.
Okay, good to know. The next question is, when a via is pushed during tuning or routing, will it also move traces in all other layers that might then violate the rules? So I guess as a result of tuning, a via gets shoved and it creates some sort of other violation.
So because we're in a auto routing environment inside of Paths Professional, the tool will not create violations amongst other things that get pushed around. So if I push a via and it ends up touching another trace, it's going to push that trace. Now, if I end up pushing or trying to push that via and it obviously can't move every other object around it to make the proper amount of space, then it's not going to end up moving that via to begin with, and it won't let me route in that area. So the tool is not going to let you create a violation based on what you're doing, because it would create a violation somewhere else. That's definitely an illegal state. And you don't want that to happen, because that goes back and creates all kinds of headaches related to cleanup and such. But in my example in the demonstration, I did show some powerful capability where if, let's say, I had routed an area of the board and then we decided to change the design rules, and those design rules made it so that the traces either now had trace to trace violations or trace to via violations, we can turn on dynamic DRC and it will show us where all those violations are after we change the design rule. And then we have a really cool feature where I can select everything and I can say fix, and the tool will go back and fix everything that it has the capability of doing as far as moving other objects around without creating more violations. So in that section of the board where I showed that capability happening, it was able to fix 100% of the violations occurred, because I took a rule from 5 to 6 mils, where if I had to do that by hand, I would have been there for hours trying to fix all that, and the tool did it in like 2 seconds.
Sure.
So amazing
Absolutely.
Technology.
It is.
All right, so John, I have a couple more questions here. Can you move a part with all of the fan outs? I showed it again a little bit in the webinar where I was moving some components in a section where parts were or traces had already been placed. But yes, Paths Professional, and I'm going to even say Paths Standard and Standard Plus for those people that are using those tools, have the capability when you pick up a component, it knows that there's traces and vias attached to it, and it will automatically pick those up with that component. You don't have to do any type of weird group selection. And as I move that part around, you'll see it push and shove traces and vias in the locations where you're trying to place that new part. So yes, you can absolutely move components with fan out vias already placed. So that's why I'm saying it's always very important, once you place the board, just go ahead and fan out your entire board. You're not limited to modifications later on. You can just pick up a part and move it with all the fan outs, just like you didn't have the traces there to begin with. Here's one that came up. I didn't necessarily show this in the presentation, but it's a good question to answer. Can you customize thermals for vias and pins while in the design, or do you have to go back to the library? And the answer is no, you absolutely do not have to go back to the library. Yes, you can do it directly in the design you're working on. So you can select a via, multiple vias, a pin of a component, and customize the thermal and how the plane will attach to that part. Again, very powerful capability. You can add more thermals around it. You can make them bigger. You can do flood over if you want. So absolutely, yes, you can do that on the fly, and it does not affect the part absolutely in the library. So here's another good one. Can you place other planes inside a dynamic plane area? I talked about, obviously some of the automation around plane functionality in Paths Professional and how powerful the dynamic plane function is, and that you can basically use the board outline as a plane area, so I don't even have to waste time drawing my plane area for an entire layer. So if you have a really complex board outline, all I have to do is say, hey, this is going to be a plane layer. It's dynamic. I'm going to assign these nets to this layer. This is going to be the primary. And after I'm done setting that up, it automatically floods the plane. Now, since I've assigned maybe more nets to that layer, I can still go in and draw the shapes where I need them to be inside that main plane area, and the tool will just automatically, again, and keep the proper spacing between those two nets based on that new plane area. So yes, you can place planes inside of a dynamic plane area without any issues, and the tool just manages everything for you automatically. The real power of dynamic planes, though, is being able to move vias and traces around and not having to go back and reflood the design again. You see everything 100% real time, which is a major time saver. It allows a lot of people to do stuff in a design they've never really probably thought of before, like making sure they don't have any via fences in a plane area where there's no plane material going between the vias. Now you can see them and you can slightly separate them and make sure you have nice ground return paths or power return paths through those via pin fields.
So is that all your questions, Brent?
Yeah, it looks like that was what was asked during the webinar. Again, thank you everyone for attending. A lot of good questions. Hopefully everyone will start using routing automation in their design processes, as it's definitely a huge time saver. And take a serious look at Paths Professional if you're not using it today, because it'll help you design your boards way faster than you possibly are today.
Thanks again for joining me, Brent. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
And thank you for joining our second in this special After the Webinar Series podcast. For more information on this podcast, as well as a link to the on-demand replay of the webinar discussed, be sure to check out the show notes. There you'll also find additional information related to this podcast along with my email address. So feel free to send me your comments and questions or any topics you'd like to hear me talk about, or if you'd like to be my guest right here on PCB Tech Talk. I'm John McMillan. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And be sure to catch the next episode of PCB Tech Talk.